Hey guys, Marshall Apologist here. Somebody left me a comment on one of my videos, wanted me to just sort of go through some other videos and see what I can make of them. And I'll put the link to the original video here so you can kind of watch it for yourself. I don't really like the video that I'm responding to very much because it seems to be trying to build a case based on some very spurious reasoning and very spurious evidence. It's not real strong and it's been dealt with forever. But regardless, the first thing it talks about is how Christians often make the argument that they are Christians because of the validity of the Gospels. Perhaps I'll get this thing out of my camera. There we go. That's not why anybody's a Christian. I mean, I don't personally know anybody who's ever made the argument, well, we know the Gospels are all 100% fact, so that's why I'm a Christian. That doesn't happen. Maybe that's not what the video intended to mean, but he didn't go into detail, so I don't know. It's like 5 minutes long. I don't know what to tell you. And no, the Gospels wouldn't be the only proof of anything concerning what people... The issue at hand is what I've seen blown up completely out of proportion many, many times, which is they say, well, the Gospels are where we get our information from Jesus. Therefore, if we can't be certain of those, we can't be certain of anything about Jesus because that's all there is. Which is, I understand why that's being said, but it's wrong. It's really, really wrong. The Gospels are where people who had gotten information about Jesus chose to record that information. There were people, you have to keep in mind, there were people alive, walking around, and talking about Jesus, and talking about the things that he talked about, all over the place, years and years and years before any of the Gospels were written. And the Gospels aren't even close to the oldest sources of information concerning what people believed in Christianity about Jesus or anything else. It's not even close. The Gospels are great information about the life of Jesus, but they are, first of all, not the origin of the information about Jesus. Jesus himself is the origin of the information about Jesus. Secondarily, were the apostles and those who followed him, any number of people who were speaking to the oral traditions that they would have passed along and so forth. You have to keep in mind, this is historically rooted in events. That just is the case. Bart Ehrman, who is not a friend of the Christian, especially theologically, would tell you that this is the case. Jesus lived, he had followers, they told people stuff, people wrote stuff down. We would debate about the points on who wrote what down and when, but that's what happened. The basic outline of how this happened historically, Bart Ehrman would completely agree with and think you're an absolute drooling idiot if you thought that that wasn't the case. So, he talks about how the gospel authors weren't known. They're anonymous. Well, they're pseudo-anonymous. John was written not so veiled, in a not so veiled way. The only apostle of Jesus that John doesn't mention by name, the Gospel of John doesn't mention by name, is John. Right off the bat. Big red flag. The next thing up is he only refers to the apostle John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Everybody knows that's John. He was saying, he didn't want to say I, and he didn't want to say me, because that's just not what you do when you're writing an ancient Roman biography on somebody, even one as out of the way and odd as the book of John. You just don't insert yourself into the story directly that way. Most of the time, there are exceptions, but that's just not what was done. So it's pretty obvious that John intended that one to be known about him, and he just didn't want to make himself seem all that much more important. Which is weird, because he still referred to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. So, I don't know. It's weird, I'll grant you that it's weird, but that's pretty much everybody knows that that's what happened. As for Mark is Peter. Historically, the gospel authors are known. Because historically, you'd have guys that say, I studied under Mark studied under Peter. And they know this. And no one tested them on it. No one wrote against that. There weren't any bishops of any place at all that were like, no, you didn't. You're a liar. Like, none of the people they said were heretics, like Marcion. Marcion didn't study under a guy who was, like, directly under one of the apostles or anything. Like, no. Like, Polycarp wouldn't have challenged anybody. No one ever challenged these things. And this isn't like it's an absence of evidence. But no, it's like these guys challenged each other in the first couple of centuries all the time about what would today be thought of the most petty theological things. And nobody challenged anybody as to claiming who wrote what when. So, pretty good chance. There's some debate, actually, because he goes through making a really big deal of the Gospel of Mark being the first gospel. And it might be. Q, the document, is probably not actually a document. It's probably just the oral tradition that was passed around from the apostles and disciples and pretty much everybody who ever ran into Jesus. And that source would be anonymous because it's pluralistic in its foundation. First of all, you couldn't pin it down to one particular person or one particular saying or one particular area or one particular time. It was just all over the entire area of Israel. And different people saying different things, and people collating things, and mostly trying to get back to what the apostles were saying. And keep in mind, the Gospels were written well within the lifetimes of the apostles, too. Like, some people want to make a big deal. Well, John couldn't have been anybody that would have known Jesus. It couldn't be an eyewitness document. It was written so late. Well, yeah, but John would have lived... Like, it was known that he lived quite a long time. Like, it's not even... Like in John, it talked about the disciple whom Jesus loved wasn't going to die from martyrdom and so forth. And people have this idea that, because the average death age at the time, like the average rate you would live to was like 30 or 35 years old. Well, then by 35, you'd be dead. No, it's not how it works. It means that like 6 out of 10 babies died as babies, which really skews the number in a bad way. And basically, if you made it to adulthood, you would still live to be 60, 70, 80 years old. 80 would be a really old guy, but it wasn't unheard of or that terribly uncommon. Most high priests continued to be the high priest of the temple well into their 60s. So it wasn't like it was unheard of that you'd be that old. It was just most people didn't make it to adulthood. So, and if they did, maybe they had to be a soldier or they got hurt or something, they would die from disease or whatever. But if they didn't die from any of those things, your natural lifespan really wasn't that short. So, the idea that they couldn't have been written during the times of the apostles, because surely they'd all be dead. Well, no, if they were in their 20s or so, which they probably would have been, pretty much everybody knows that, then, yeah, it wouldn't really be that outstanding to live to the 40s or 60s or 70s AD. And you're getting old, you're starting to die, maybe. You're thinking, I better write this down. Makes sense. He talks about how they couldn't have been written by eyewitnesses, but yeah, they could have. There are tons of details that, in the Gospels, there are lots of details about lots of things that, in point of fact, some things historians are still quibbling about, but a lot of things historians used to say, that never happened, so we know the Gospels are not reliable historically at all, period, because this was never even the case. Or like the book of Acts was real big on that for a long time. Luke Acts was just like, this is totally ahistorical. This people group didn't even exist. But yeah, it turns out they did. And you wouldn't have known that if you hadn't been there at the time. So, was it all eyewitnesses? Probably not. Was some of it eyewitness testimony? Yeah, probably. Because a lot of the details in the stories are things that, at a minimum, you had to be someone from that area at that time that Jesus was around to know the things that somebody would have known. Now, you may not have been an eyewitness, but you at least had to be somebody from that area. And, you know what? Come on, just give me the point on that one. At that point, you're just... just Occam's razor that thing. Just go, you know what, the simplest explanation that doesn't multiply the questions rather than the answers, yeah, we'll just go with that. We'll say that at least some of the details in the Gospels were eyewitness details. And all of it was written by people from the area at the time. There's just no disputing that. I don't know of any scholar who disputes that other than Richard Carrier, but he's a lunatic, so The video makes a big deal out of the Gospels being written decades later. That's a point in favor of the Christian, not against him. We don't have any biographies of anyone, even up to 300 years after the fact, that we have any copies of any of that within 100 years of the person being alive. And the further back you go, the worse it gets. Not even just the extant manuscripts of the time, but like when the thing was written. Like, people just don't write biographies of the Josephus isn't really a biography, so it doesn't really count that way, but Josephus was writing about things anywhere from 100 years from before he was born, roughly speaking, to, a decade or a few years before he, was finished writing. And the reason for that is very simple. You needed to have that much time. The idea that you'd write a biography about somebody within 20 years or 10 years or 5 years of them being alive, and by the way, I'd really like to know a solid number as to how early a biography has to be reliable, is ridiculous, and no one ever did that. So, the fact that they were that early, and that we might possibly have, I think, a piece of the Gospel of, it's either Mark or Luke, I can't remember, I think it's Luke, that might possibly even be from the late 1st century, is astounding. But at the very least, we have P52, which we know is from the 2nd century, which is amazingly early compared to anything else we have that talks about that time period. We don't have any of the works of Josephus anywhere near that kind of a date. So, he shot himself in the foot there. I don't know what he was doing with that. So, here's going to be the bigger thing. Get rid of all the copies of the Gospels. Don't even read them. All right? Here's what we can know about Jesus. We can know that he lived, was born, I think by the Virgin Mary. You can confirm that with it. Suffered and died under Pontius Pilate, and was dead for 3 days and raised to life again. We can know that without anything in the entire Gospels. All you need is 1 Corinthians. And we know that 1 Corinthians contains that information because Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and it's one of the few books that we can absolutely be certain the most skeptical atheist in the world will say, yeah, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Bart Ehrman knows Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. He has never even imagined even starting to argue at that point. It's not even on his radar, and it never will be, because we know it happened. And Bart Ehrman would even argue, along with Gary Habermas, and a number of scholars on the issue, that the bit in there about Jesus being died, buried, and resurrected after 3 days is a creedal statement. It takes a creedal form. And based on some estimates on how creedal forms come to be and spread and whatnot, we can be pretty sure that that creed was around within about 3 years of the death of Christ. Some might stretch it out to 5. Give me 5. 5 years after the death of Christ, and people are spreading this creed around as just a known given fact. Sorry, we do know that that happened as a point of fact. And so then all the Gospels that attest to that are basically just trying to give a detailed account of that thing. So no, the resurrection doesn't account on that. There's Gnostic elements in John. I'd like to see that proven. If there was no resurrection in Mark, then why did the young man dressed in white, say Jesus was raised from the dead, is what that means. Yeah, it wasn't an appearance, but someone said it, and then it got wrote down like they believed that happened. And then also 1 Corinthians predates all the Gospels, and by a fair bit. So, yeah, you're done.